Hello, this is Oisa, and we're welcoming everybody to the webinar, 2018 NACA Application Tips and Strategies. I'm trying to see how many folks have joined us so far. About 16 of y'all. Well, we're on time right now. Let me give it one more minute and give a couple more folks time to join us. But we'll start shortly. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. I saw a couple more folks joined us. And so just wanted to welcome everybody again to the 2018 NACA Application Tips and Strategy webinar. This webinar is scheduled to go for an hour, but there's a lot of material to cover. So in the interest of forewarning everybody, we might go a touch over. But yeah, we'll go ahead and jump in. Can you go to the next slide? Thank you. So the presenters today are going to be me. This is Heather Rodemaker-Taylor with First Nations Oista. Caleb Selby, our programs officer, will also be joining everybody. And Emily Trump, our lending and capitalization manager, will be joining us as well. And so first, to get started, we want to kind of have everybody fill in what organization are you representing today? And so we'll give everybody a couple of seconds if you want to type that into the chat box. So yeah. So I see quite a few people. You see Community Financial, Chapie, Tiwa Lending, Hawaiian Community Assets. Okay, I see Cook Inlet. I see a bunch of folks. Thank you. And so we actually have a couple of quick poll questions, too, that we're going to ask the group before we get started. And so the first poll question is going to be, has your organization ever been funded by the CDFI fund? And so we're going to go ahead and launch that and give you all a couple of seconds to answer that.
Your answers are helpful because it frames how we talk about some of the content today, so appreciate your answers.
Perfect. So I'm seeing the polling come in. Give you all a couple more seconds. Okay, looks like about almost 90% of y'all voted, and it looks like, yes, the majority of you have been funded by the CDFI fund, which is awesome to hear. And about 20% of y'all said no. Okay, and so we're going to go ahead and launch our next poll question. And so with this one, are you planning on applying for the NACA TA award or the NACA FA award? Again, like Caleb mentioned, this will give us a good idea when we're talking about everything, about who we're talking to. Perfect. So I'll give you all a couple seconds to answer that poll too. Okay, so it looks like about 75%, okay, we're into the 80s now, have voted, and it looks like it's actually about half and half between TA and FA with probably another 20%, not quite sure. So hopefully when we go through this, it'll give you a good idea of what the applications will entail, and maybe it'll help you make that decision too. So I'm glad we're going to be covering both the TA and the FA applications in this webinar. Okay, cool. So we'll go ahead and dive in. One of the first things I wanted to cover was kind of housekeeping and some key deadlines. So in general, the next deadline that's coming up, and this is related to if you're also submitting a certification application, And so February 28th, tomorrow, is the last day to contact certification, compliance, monitoring, and evaluation staff about that certification. And you do that via AMIS. And then March 2nd, Friday, is going to be a huge deadline. So it's the last day for CDFI certification applications that can go with the NACA application. It's also going to be the last day that you can create an AMIS account if you're a new applicant, which you need to be able to submit the application. And it's also going to be the last day to submit your SF424. So that's what's going to make that a pretty big deadline, and you'll probably hear me repeat that several times throughout this webinar. And so remember with the SF424 too, that's going to be submitted through grants.gov. All applicants have to submit their SF424 through grants.gov on or before that March 2nd deadline. And if it's not successfully accepted in grants.gov by the deadline, the CDFI fund's not going to review any of the materials that you submit into AMIS, and the application is going to be ineligible. So it kind of just shuts everything down right there. So that's why we really want to highlight that. And then if you haven't been on grants.gov, that's definitely something that should be the highest of priorities. You want to make sure that you go and register as soon as possible and get set up on there. And then another question that we see quite often from folks is, I'm filling out the SF424, but I haven't quite figured out what my ask is going to be yet. And that's something that you don't have to stress about. If the amount on your SF424 is different from the amount that you ultimately put in AMIS for your award request, the CDFI fund's only going to consider the AMIS requested amount, so don't stress about that part either. And then in terms of just tips for filling out the SF424, on the CDFI fund's website, we really recommend you use the pre-application guide. Pages 5 through 7 literally go over each boxed question and from the SF424, and they provide different guidance. And they'll even say like, oh, fill X in here. This is not applicable to you. This should be already pre-filled. So it'll be a really easy way to just go through that without any stress. So we just really want to make sure to highlight that. And then the last two deadlines that you'll see here are April 2nd, which is the last day to contact NACA program staff with any questions. And then April 4th, which is when applications are fully due. So we just really wanted to kind of do some housekeeping and just really get those dates on your radar, have you put them on your calendars, that kind of thing. Perfect. So now we're going to jump into some quick tips for preparing the NACA. And actually, I want to pause here and see if we had any questions too. Make sure I don't ignore those. Do we have any questions, Flo? No, it looks like we're good right now. Perfect. I just wanted to pause in case I was missing anybody. So great. So if we're jumping into the tips for preparing the NACA, in general, past performance is going to be something you really want to pay attention to. Make sure you're current on reports and kind of really dealing with those pieces. Even if you get in reports that you might be working on by the NOFA deadline, it helps just to make sure you're trying to do everything you can to be in compliance with the fund. Mainly because the fund's not going to consider you as an applicant if you have previously executed agreements for awards and they've determined you're non-compliant or have notified you you're ineligible. So just make sure you're checking on those so that you either rectify what you can or save yourself any time. And then also you want to make sure that you're creating and updating any AMIS information. And we'll go a little bit into some tips on AMIS too. Because remember, even though I was saying you're going to submit your SF424 through grants.gov, really AMIS is the system you're going to be working in for the application. So either get familiar with it if you're not familiar yet, refamiliarize yourself with the system, but really jump in there and start filling in any information you can be filling in for the application if you're not already. Make sure you have the right contact people in there, authorized users, all that kind of stuff. And then all entities, if you haven't already and you're really hitting the last of the deadlines for this, make sure you're registered or up to date in SAMS.gov, SAM.gov, grants.gov, AMIS, all that. Again, I'm hitting that March 2nd deadline for your SF424 as another tip for preparing for NACA. And then just a nice friendly reminder that TA awards are $10,000 to $150,000. And FA awards are $150,000 to $1 million is what you can ask for. And then another tip that we had too is really visit the CDFI Fund's website. They have a lot of materials there that as an OISTA team, we've really read through and are really helpful, especially the TA and FA guides. Between the guidance on each question, the associated tips, which they've updated a little bit, particularly for sponsoring entities on the TA application, and we'll actually review the updates on the FA application when we get to that part of the webinar. You can go there to look for scoring guidance on the questions, and there's really just a lot of insight into what the fund is looking for in your responses, so we really can't highlight that enough. And so then some general writing tips for your NACA application. Again, you're really going to want to be hitting quantitative and qualitative information, both facts and stories. What we've been seeing in more and more years is that the fund has been kind of leaning away from looking at your stories and really wanting more of that hard-hitting data. So as much data as you can be collecting and really entering with specific detail in your narrative is going to really be helpful in making your application stronger. And, like we're saying, if you have a training, try not to say, approximately so-and-so, 50 people attended our training. You want to say, we held 5 classes and X amount of people, with your specific number for each class attended each time. And so you really want to have that level of detail when you're entering information or writing your narrative. And so we also have another tip here around market data. And so if at all possible, really try to use market data that's 5 or less years old. That's just going to make your application stronger. It's going to make it more relevant, the information you're sharing. So we like to hammer that home. Again, make sure your AMIS tables are consistent with your narrative. So any of the numbers you're entering, I'm thinking projections here, or if you're talking about your budget or your management or your staff, make sure that you're saying the same thing in your narrative. And then lastly, I can't stress this enough either, is be specific and clear. Really be thoughtful about, how you're organizing the information so that you're, one, directly answering the question that the fund is asking, and also, weighing in any of those tips they give you to make sure you're addressing any of those factors too, but then also making sure that you're telling your story in a way that's coherent and not just kind of data dumping into those answers. And so if we can stress that, that would be something to really keep in mind as you build your application, especially with your narrative. And then we also mentioned that we would be talking about some AMIS tips too. And so again, we already said this, but follow the TA and the FA guidelines. They're really going to help you here. You also want to think about using the NOFA as a checklist. The NOFA is going to go over details of the required application documents and pieces. So it's going to cover AMIS, the SF424, NACA program application components, like your funding application detail, data, charts, narrative sections, and key attachments. And so it's really going to be a good place to make sure that you haven't forgotten any pieces and that you're doing exactly what you need to for submitting the application. And then you'll see here that we bolded and underlined this, but really double and triple check your entries into AMIS. It's so easy with so much information to enter, and information you might be updating and information that you're trying to transcribe from somewhere else to make mistakes. And so, we do this internally at OISTA, and so we really just like to hammer that home in terms of an AMIS tip too. And then another tip is thinking about character count. So, and they actually put this in the guidance from the CDFI Fund too, but we've seen it when we've kind of submitted applications and been working in the AMIS system, is that the character count that you see in a Word doc, when you copy and paste it into AMIS, it's not necessarily going to be the exact same character count. And so especially if you've gotten to exactly 3,000 characters, for instance, it could be cutting off words. So make sure that nothing is being cut off that you weren't planning for, and just be aware that when you're working towards the very kind of limit of those character counts, that you're aware that that might not necessarily be reflective in what the character count will be in AMIS, what you're seeing in your Word doc. So we just like to let people know that too. And then if you run into any issues with the system, because it could be a user error or it could be a glitch in the system, just make sure to either call the help desk at the CDFI Fund or submit a ticket through AMIS.
Yeah, and if I could piggyback on that, Heather, there's a tab in AMIS called Service Requests, and I've actually found that utility to be really useful. That's how the fund is asking you to submit questions to them at this time, and I think asking the questions in the way that they ask sort of expedites their response. I found it to be really helpful. So
Thanks, Caleb. And then finally, an obvious tip, but don't wait to submit until the last minute. Always a very good tip that we like to repeat over and over and over, because there's nothing more stressful than either, like I said, dealing with a user error or a glitch in the system, you know, when you have 5 minutes left to submit your whole application and you have a lot riding on it. So just wanted to make sure to point that out too. Perfect. So then, like I said, specifically, we're going to go into the TA and the FA applications and just kind of give different tips and suggestions. And so I'm going to be talking about the TA application, and Caleb is going to be talking about the FA application. And so I'm just going to jump into the TA now. And so with the TA application, remember, even though I already said this, but you can ask for up to $150,000. And also, like I said, there's only been some minor changes and tweaks to the TA application for this year. It's mainly around the tips, and then they added a lot of very specific guidance for sponsoring entities. So if you're that type of applicant, you're in luck, because they added a lot more detail, which is really helpful. And then just want to hammer this home too, of what you can use the TA word for. So the eligible use of funds is compensation for personnel, compensation for fringe benefits, professional service costs, travel costs, training and education costs, equipment, and then finally supplies. And so really in any way that's going to help you build your capacity as an organization. And so the reason I highlighted this is the fund sees a lot of ineligible expenses in applications. And it really aggravates them. So we'd like to make sure that they're happy when they're reading through applications and don't disqualify people in any way. So really do a double check in the application documents and the NOFA that you're writing for an eligible expense, and really keep that in mind. And then finally, with the TA application, there's going to be some required AMIS pieces. So you've got your funding application detail, which is really just general and administrative information. You've got your narrative that you're going to paste in. You've got your application financial data, which includes your 3 historic years of records, your current year, your 3 projected year responses, and then you're going to have your additional components as part of that application. And those would be your TA budget table, including justifications. And with those, you really want to make sure that even though you only have 500 characters, you tie those to your strategic goals. You tie those to building your capacity if it's addressing a weakness. You talk about if it's going to help you become certified if you're not yet certified, etc. And then any other kind of data and charts as listed in AMIS. And then finally, the last part of kind of thinking about the TA application is the narrative specifically. And so you're going to have section 1, which is for uncertified applicants only, and is 5 questions. And then you're going to have section 2, which is for all applicants, but making sure you look at each question to see who they apply to, because not all questions apply to all applicants, to make it, very clear. And so those are the 2 pieces that I'm going to review. And then before I get into those pieces, I also wanted to quickly touch on the review scoring criteria, just so you have a good idea of what the fund will be evaluating. And so with this, this is actually, you can find guidance on this in the TA application evaluation process document. That document on the CDFI Fund's website is going to include the general reviewer guidance. And honestly, it's really good to check that for each question too, and kind of take that feedback in conjunction with the specific question guidance and tips that the fund also provides you. And that gives you as much information as possible about each question and what you should be addressing in each of those questions. And that's what we do ourselves when we're writing or reviewing applications. And so really, I also wanted to point out that the TA application review process has 3 steps. There's an eligibility review, a business plan review, and a final award decision. And so as you see here in section 1 is only reviewed for uncertified applicants, and they're the only ones that have to actually, answer those questions as well. And so uncertified applicants have to achieve a minimum score of 35 points in this section to be considered for an award, and to be reviewed in section 2 for their answers they provided. And then section 2, that reviews all applicants. And so you actually have to get a score of 50 points for the TA components to be considered for an award, and that's for all applicants. If you're a not yet certified entity, for both Section 1 and 2, you have to get at least 50 points to move on to the next level of review. And so when thinking about review process as well, an applicant that's a certified CDFI is going to be evaluated on the need you show for TA funding to build your capacity, to further your strategic goals, and to achieve impact in your target market. And if you're an emerging or certifiable CDFI or emerging CDFI, you're going to be evaluated on your demonstrated need for funding to build capacity and reach your strategic goals as well. But the big piece there is going to be they want to see a demonstrated capability and plan to achieve CDFI certification. They really want you to hammer that home. And that's within 3 years, unless you're a sponsoring entity, in which case your plan's evaluated on a 4-year basis. Also, if you're a prior awardee, the CDFI fund is going to evaluate your plan to achieve certification by the date you set forth in the assistance agreement for your prior TA award. So that's definitely something to keep in mind too. And so all that being said about that piece of the review process is once you've gotten at least 50 points in either Section 2 or both Section 1 and Section 2, they're going to make a final award decision. And so what they're going to do is analyze different programmatic and financial risk factors. And so they're going to look at financial stability, history of performance in managing federal awards, including timeliness and reporting and compliance, which is why we were saying that's so important. Reports and findings from audits, if applicable, and your ability to effectively implement federal requirements. And then for those uncertified folks, the fund's also going to evaluate your ability to meet certification criteria. And so once all of those applications are approved by a selecting official, they'll do that final due diligence, and then they're going to rank all of the applications, and then they're going to go from highest to lowest and just keep funding until all available funds have been depleted. So we just wanted to give you a good idea of what's going to be weighted, what they're going to be looking at before we kind of go into more specifics around the questions too. Perfect. And in terms of time, we're doing pretty well. So I'm going to try to make sure I work through this section and still leave Caleb plenty of time for his FA application. But yeah, like I said, Section 1 is going to be for uncertified applicants only. And so as you saw on that scoring metric, it's worth 75% of your application. So you really want to focus quite a bit on this section. And really, you can see the focus is on certifiability. So you'll see here that they have mission, financing entity, target market, accountability, development services, and those are 5 of the 7 certification requirements of the CDFI fund, and that's why they kind of organized everything that way. And so with the mission, you're really going to want to have a good idea of who you want to serve or have started serving already, and what you want to provide in terms of products and services or have started providing, and really try to be as clear as possible if you have a good idea. You know, really spell out those products and services if you already know what they're going to be. Like, this is a small business loan and we're going to be serving, you know, X, you know, clients and doing this exact work. That's really what they want to see here. You also want to make the case that these products and services support the mission of both community development and your target market. And like I said, more specifics you can have here, the better. Even if you haven't yet, you know, gotten that far along in the process, if you can have specifics in terms of how you're going to plan to decide on those services too and those products, that's really what you want to touch on here. And then with the financing entity piece, this too is going to be where you want to kind of talk about your plan and timeline to start lending, or your lending activities that you've done thus far, and your pipeline for lending if you have that information. They also want to see here how you're going to determine demand and how you're tracking this. You know, maybe you've completed a market study and you have that information. Maybe you're going to complete a market study and that's what you want to use these funds for, to better gauge demand. Like, you really want to put that kind of detail in here, as well as specific steps on how you're going to get ready to lend if you haven't done so already. How your staff or your structure is going to support that. If you've already started and you don't have big numbers, you still want to enter them here. Like, how many loans have you started actually releasing to clients, and exactly what timeline you've done that too. That's what they want to see in this section. And they also want to see capitalization for lending here too. So if you either have a source of funding or you have one that you're lining up, they want detail around that too, so that they know that you're supporting this lending in the long term. And then with the target market, for certified folks, this is actually going to be in section 2, question 3, but the same kind of feedback applies. The biggest thing here, one piece is going to be cite your sources. I see that quite a bit when we review different applications where there's a lot of good information, but the information isn't cited, so try to do that. And this is really going to be a straightforward description of, you know, your location, who you plan to focus on serving, who you may have already focused on serving. They've also added in some language about they want to see how you plan to verify that clients you're serving are part of your target market. You can also, again, talk about any market studies here or make that request to do additional market research. But again, if you have information on your demand here about your target market, really be specific. Exact numbers is going to be really important here to really make the case. And then the fund also wants to see that becoming a certified CDFI will increase your capacity to address the needs and challenges of your current or proposed target market, and how. So you're going to want to also include information on that here. And then finally, they have accountability. And so this really relates to your board recruitment and representation. So, you know, talk about like how it's reflective of your target market, how your board is part of your community, how they tie in, what they're going to bring to the organization in terms of skills. And if you haven't yet created a board, this is where you're going to want to talk about a concrete plan for board recruitment and what you're going to be looking for in those board members. And so that's what they're looking for in this part. And then finally, development services. So they want to see in specifics what you plan to offer, what you already offer. And if it's already being offered, they want you to have tracked some data and provide some specific information in terms of how many people you've served, how many trainings you've held, how many people have attended those trainings. And then in addition to the description of those services, what you've been doing with clients, they also want to know how that complements the lending. So for instance, let's say you're doing building Native communities training, and so you have a lot of really great figures around that. You know, you want to make sure you provide that, but then also tie into how you have a credit builder or credit repair loan product, and how this is helping you work people you know, into being able to take advantage of that product, and how those really work well together. So those would be like one example of what you can talk about there if that's your product or service. And they really want to kind of hear more about if you have any data management services, you know, that you can be using to track those development services you're providing. This would be a good space to talk about it. You can talk about how you're marketing your development services, if you've surveyed people for level of satisfaction with your services. And any kind of partners too, you can kind of mention them here, even though there is a partnership question later. So really you want to be as specific as possible and talk about either what you started offering or what you will be offering. And then, like I said, section 2 is really going to be for all applicants with some exceptions. So you want to make sure to really carefully follow the instructions to know which questions you can skip. And so these are going to be 10 questions. So here you're really going to be covering strategic goals, creating a CDFI, that's question number 2, and that applies only to sponsoring entities, target market, impact, management, partnerships, capitalization, financial health, milestones, and risk/mitigation. And so with the strategic goals question, which is going to be question 1, you really want to connect specific strategic goals and use of your award and how you're going to use that to build your capacity to meet those strategic goals. And so that's going to be really important. You want to talk about how you're going to achieve those strategic goals, how you're going to address your target market needs and challenges, and also organizational sustainability. That's what the fund wants to see with this question. I mean, really you want to kind of answer and give the big picture. We usually recommend picking the top 3 most compelling strategic goals because there usually isn't much space for 5 or 6. And you really kind of want to have that focus of, you know, maybe 3 or 4 strategic goals too, and how, again, they relate to increasing capacity and meeting target market needs and building organizational sustainability. And so, you know, if you don't have a strategic plan or are worried about pulling from a current strategic plan, you don't have to worry about that. You really want to think about these strategic goals as, you know, things that are definitely important for your organization, but things that you are tailoring for this application to make the case for funding and making the case for building your capacity. And the way we like to think about organizing it is really like, list your 3 strategic goals or your 4 strategic goals, and then potentially you could list how you want to use the funds to support those, and how they can help you achieve those strategic goals. And then also, and this is only going to be if you're an uncertified native CDFI and you're applying here, if you've received a prior TA award, in this question you have to address how you're going to meet the CDFI certification requirements by the date you establish in that assistance agreement for your first TA award. So I know I mentioned that already, but this is really going to be a question where you want to address that. And so then in terms of question 2, like I said, that one is about creating a CDFI and is really only for sponsoring entities. So otherwise you can skip that question. This really needs to be a specific plan for creating a separate entity and support a new CDFI to get certified in a certain time frame that you make sure you outline, and be very specific in this plan. And then question 3, which addresses the target market. Here, you only have to answer if you're already a certified CDFI. And so here, like I said, I covered quite a bit on what you talk about when discussing your target market. So it'd be a lot of the same advice as before. Again, you're just going to want to demonstrate your products and services are coordinating to meet target market needs and challenges. And then 4 is going to talk about impact, and that is also only for certified applicants to answer. Otherwise, you can skip that question. And so with this one, you want to evaluate the impact of your products and services. This is really where you want to plug in your success stories, your data, hours you've spent, new businesses you've created, number of loans closed, all that kind of information is really where you can highlight it here. And then question 5 that you'll see here is all about management. And so this is going to focus on management and key staff, how they're going to help you achieve strategic goals. And so if you follow the tips from the fund, here they say like you really want to focus on not having this be a reiteration of resumes, but how it's going to tie to strategic goals. So really keep that in mind. And again, here, then you can mention your strategic goals again and kind of have that as a continuing thread throughout your application.
And I just want to add on the management, because it's very tempting to just repeat your resume. What they're looking for is accomplishments. Mm-hmm. So instead of saying, I was a housing counselor for 3 years, you say, I was a housing counselor for 3 years and counseled 672 first-time home buyers and got 57 of them into houses. That's the sort of thing they want to see. So really brag about your accomplishments. If you've, increased loan volume by 72%, say that. Just like you're specific about the impacts you create for your clients, you want to be specific about your own achievements and your staff's achievements.
No, that's perfect, and that's exactly right. And if you're a newer organization and maybe you either don't have staff yet or you're recruiting staff, this is where you can talk about what you're looking for, and you could kind of highlight key skills you're bringing in. So it talks about how you're maybe using these funds to pay those personnel costs and what experience you're looking to bring and how that's going to build your capacity. And so you can also touch on those pieces. And then 6, you'll see partnerships. And so that's for everybody to answer, regardless of the applicant type. And here they really want to see that you're working not in a silo, but you're working as much as possible with other partners to provide comprehensive products and services for your target market. And this one we see quite a bit is people really like to list everybody they've partnered with. And you don't get as much of a character count in this question. And that's really not exactly what they want to see. They want to see more depth than breadth. And so they want to see, like, kind of maybe think about focusing on a couple of really key partnerships that help you reach your target market or achieve certain specific strategic goals, and mention them by name and have a lot of detail about what that partnership entails and what that means. That's what they want to see in this question. And so that would be the best tip we can give there. And again, you can always come back to those strategic goals as your touchstone. And so then 7 is really around capitalization, and that's going to be, again, for everybody to answer. And so this is where you want to talk about financial support for your strategic goals that do not include the CDFI fund. They want to know that you're not only relying on them as your sole source of funding. They want to know that you're either getting funds or have plans to get funds from other public and private funders. And so with this, really be specific about amounts and goals and names if there are different foundations or funders, next steps for future funding, like what you're going to do to pursue funding, what your funding pipeline might be, who's secured, who's a prospect, really as much information as you can put in here as possible. They want to see that you have some other plan for being sustainable other than this award. And so that moves us into 8, which talks about financial health. And this one, again, everybody answers. And so this is where they kind of want to talk about financial performance, where your current MAPS figures can fit in, where you can discuss kind of key ratios and address any weaknesses or strengths. And so you'll see in the guidance that they literally say address capitalization, earnings, self-sufficiency, portfolio at risk, charge-offs, and loan loss reserves. I would do that. I would address those exact things. That's what they say to do. And anything else that you think speaks well of the organization that might be internal financial portfolio goals or metrics. And if you're newer, you can talk projections around these figures and your associated plan for positive financial health or portfolio management. And those might be things like talking about developing loan policies or key staffing or, development services that are going to, make you have better borrowers. And that's how you'd answer it if you're a newer organization. But yeah, like I said, I'd literally list each one of those items I talked about and have an explanation and maybe talk about why each is strong or weak and have a good explanation there. You could also list a few extra internal health ratios that aren't listed. So this might be like if you have higher deployment, maybe you have good funder diversification, higher liquidity. You might think about a few internal portfolio management ratios that aren't listed, like lower portfolio at risk goals. Really pick areas where you can shine and kind of have a nice story around. And then you can also explain how the organization has addressed any negative trends over the years too. If you have a good story there and now it's skewing positively, that's really where you can talk about that and make a really good case. And so one of the metrics I mentioned too was self-sufficiency. And so that's really a harder financial piece to meet as a native CDFI industry. And if you don't have a strong self-sufficiency ratio, you're definitely not alone. And so really you want to think about how you want to communicate that, saying, maybe you're in a rural area and it's generally much harder to have a higher self-sufficiency ratio because your target market size and, maybe you have to provide a lot of development services. So maybe try to think about how you're going to frame that story so that you really are making the case for why that ratio is going to be lower and make sure you state it there. And then finally, the last two questions, 9 and 10, are going to be for everybody as well. So the first one is going to be organizational milestones and progress on strategic goals. This is where I call it like reiterate and celebrate. If you had a previous TA award, also you want to mention that and talk about how you use that award to achieve strategic goals. But really just talk about like really awesome things you've done towards achieving strategic goals. And the fund really wants you to put those in chronologically. But yeah, just kind of think about that, put it in detail, organize it in a way that's going to be very clear and address the question. And then finally, the risk and mitigation section. The guidance that the fund provides has different tips on what you can pull from, and you can use those if you like. So they say like funding could be an issue, there are economic changes, demand can be an issue, competition, staffing, etc. And so really just try to pick like maybe your top 2 or 3 here and be really thoughtful around them. And feel free to be honest. Like if you're a small team, losing a staff member is always a concern. You could be mitigating that risk by cross-training your team members so that if someone leaves, you can fulfill those functions, or having organizational interns during the summer, etc. But the main here is just pick a couple that, maybe you're thinking about and address how you plan on dealing with them if in worst case scenario they happen and it looks like you're on top of things, you've pre-planned. And so that's a good place to kind of address that there. But yeah, so I think we're still doing okay on time. We're at 12:39, so I want to turn it over to Caleb to talk about the FA application because there's quite a bit in there, and the fund, while they haven't changed that part of the application, they have made some updates. So I'm going to turn it over to Caleb.
Yeah, hello everybody. So we're going to talk about the FA, NACA FA or NACA Financial Assistance Application. And I want to kick it off with just some important notes here, and also within these important notes, bring up a lot of the changes that we see in this year's application relative to last year's. So the first change is there's new scoring criteria, and I'm going to talk about this quite a bit more. It'll be the first thing that I talk about before we get into the content. I'm also going to refer you a lot to the funds. They've released an evaluation process document for the NACA FA, and it's really helpful. It tells you there's 5 steps in the scoring, and it goes in depth about what each step is looking at. Another big change to this year's application is that you're going to be held to performance goals and measures, regardless of if your requested amount is cut down or not. And that's a big change. I'm going to talk about what I think the implications of that are on funding amounts. And then also, every year there's an FA application guidance document that's released. And if you look on pages 4 and 5, and highlighted in yellow, there's some updates to the application that are organized there for you to see in one place. So I think that's pretty valuable to look at. The final thing that I want to mention on this slide is matching funds, and that's that we don't need to worry about it right now. That requirement was waived for last year's NACA. The waive is still pending for this year's NACA. So we won't know certainly until after we submit the applications this year. The expectation is that the match will be waived, but we don't know for sure just yet. So next slide. So I want to start with the scoring before I get into the content here, because I think it should inform how we write each section. And I think if we use the scoring to inform how we write, it's going to make sure that we have the best application that's going to have the best chance of getting funded. So as I was saying, the fund is going to engage in a 5-step review process. The first step is eligibility review. If you look in the NOFA, tables 6, 7, and 8, they're going to show you what characteristics you have to be eligible for a NACA FA and for NACA TA as well. The biggest change from TA applications is that you have to be certified to go for a NACA FA. And actually, you can submit a certification application. Heather was talking a little bit about that earlier. It has to be approved before award announcements, which they're saying is in September. So step 2 of the scoring process is financial analysis and compliance risk evaluation. This is conducted by the CDFI fund, and it's based on analysis of 24 financial indicators that are outlined in that FA evaluation process document. And so applications that score a 1, 2, or 3 will move on to step 3. If you receive a 4 or a 5, the CDFI fund staff will have someone else review it too. And if you get a 4 or 5 with that second person, you don't move on to step 3. The 24 financial indicators are outlined in that process document, and I encourage everyone to check those out. A lot of them are new. And I'd like to say also, while we know what ratios we're looking at, we still don't know what the ranges are for each ratio. So for each of the 24 ratios, you're getting a score from 1 to 5, and we know how to calculate the ratios. We just don't know how you're getting a 1, a 2, 3, or 4, or 5. I don't think we need to worry so much about this, just because if you look in the PowerPoint that the CDFI fund put out for their webinar about NACA FA, you'll see that 98% of NACA FA applicants got past step 2 last year. So it's not excluding as many groups as I think we imagined last year. For the compliance risk portion of step 2, it's a similar process. They're giving you a score of 1 to 5 based on, and these are words from the fund, information provided in the application. And so you get a 1, 2, or 3 to move on, and 4s and 5s will be reviewed again. And if you fail with that second person, you get a 4 or 5 again, you won't move on to step 3. The fund is using what they call the application assessment tool for step 2, and it's kind of a black box. And what I mean to say is, I'm kind of referencing how we don't know how you're getting how you're getting rated for each financial indicator. I don't know if there's weight placed on certain financial indicators, if some are more important than others. But again, I don't know that we need to worry about it so much, since 98% of applicants got out of step 2 last year. So one thing that I'd recommend for your financial projections, since we know about those 24 financial indicators, is when you build out your financial projections, make sure to have a tab in your Excel document or wherever you're building those to see where you fall with those ratios so that you can talk about them in the narrative and you have an idea of where you sit with them. So step 3 in the scoring is business plan review. This one is conducted by 2 external community development experts and not the CDFI fund staff. And so applications that meet a minimum scoring threshold of at least good are going to move on to step 4. Last year, it was 7 points for each section. So it was evenly weighted, and it was a total of 49 points. And this year, it's different. There's weighted scoring. So the business strategy, products and services, and management and track record sections are each worth 12 points, while the other sections are worth only 7. And so there's a total of 50 points this year. So keep that in mind as you prioritize sections, and I'm going to talk about which questions there's more weight on later on in this presentation as well. They're only taking the top 70% to step 4, so 30% of NACA FA applicants are being excluded at this stage of the scoring. So step 4 is what they're calling the policy objective review, and it's conducted by CDFI fund staff to determine your ability to meet policy objectives of the CDFI fund. And what they say here in their documents is that most applications will move on to step 5. And so the sections that they're using to evaluate you in this step are on the slide here in that second table. And that's economic distress, economic opportunities, and partnerships. And the reviewer guidance questions for each of these sections is outlined in the CD5 Fund PowerPoint from their webinar. And they're also in that FA evaluation process document. So as you're writing the narrative, I would have those out so that you can refer to, okay, here's how the reader is looking at this question. How can I make sure that I'm answering the question in a way that makes the most sense for the reviewer? And then finally, step 5 is the award amount determination. This is conducted by CD5 Fund staff, and based on funding availability, your deployment, and other programmatic and financial risk factors, award amounts might be reduced at this stage. Can we go into the next slide? So I'm going to break the following slides up by mostly talking about the business plan portion of the NACA, which is that step 3 where 30% of NACA FA applicants are cut. I think since that's where most of the exclusion happens, I think it's going to be good to talk about that. It's a little different from last year's application because they removed the financial position section. And in fact, in the whole application, there's less of a focus on financial position and more of a focus on impact. And so you see the final section up there is growth and projections, but there's 3 questions in that bucket, and only one of them is financially heavy. And so the CD5 Fund has helpful information about what reviewer guidance is in each of these sections, and it's in the NOFA, and it's on page 7 of the NACA evaluation process document. And I know it's kind of annoying to have me referring to these other documents, giving you page numbers and everything. In the interest of keeping this webinar kind of short, I want to do that. And also, the resources are really helpful that they've released this year. So especially that evaluation process document. Can we go to the next slide? So question 1 is asking for your board-approved mission statement, so that one's pretty simple. Question 3 is asking for demographic information of your clients, and it has an input section in AMIS as well as a narrative section. And so talk about clients and beneficiaries here, talk about race and ethnicity and income, gender, and location of your clients and beneficiaries, and really try and paint a clear picture of the population that your CD5 serves using the narrative. You know, the AMIS tables only give, they don't give the full picture of your target market. And so use the narrative to kind of complement those AMIS tables. Question 4 is asking about the major needs and challenges of your target market. And this ties directly with the AMIS tables that automatically calculate your target markets, median family income, unemployment, and poverty levels. And so target market need and inequality form the final scoring section of your FA. So you really want to be strong in this question. The 0 points on this slide just refers to the fact that it's 0 points in the business plan review step of scoring, but it's used in that step 4, the policy objective review step. So, so don't take it too lightly, these questions. And question 4 is also open to use for supplemental statistical data. And so if you've conducted a survey or market analysis, be sure to use that here, and also be sure to cite your sources. Can we go next slide?
Hey, Caleb.
Uh-huh.
And I know you're trying to get through quite a bit of information. We had a question pop up. I just want to make sure we address.
Yeah.
So somebody wanted to know the difference between the NOFA and the pre-application guidelines, and which one do they use? And I said I think they should use both, and they're just 2 separate documents. And I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah. So the FA guide is specifically for the NACA FA. The NOFA is for NACA FA and NACA TA. It kind of gives you important dates and just general information about NACA. The NACA FA application guide is specifically for the FA, gives you tips and guidance and reviewer guidance, and even examples for each question for the NACA FA. So the FA guide is more specific to the NACA FA process. And I'd also say that it's not just those 2 documents that the fund has released. So they have a matching funds guidance document. They have that evaluation process document. There's probably 9 or 10 documents for the NACA FA that I'd recommend at least taking a look at throughout the process. And so jumping to this business strategy section, for question 6, it's how do you plan to use your FA award? And so refer to the eligible uses of FA awards here, and that's talked about in the NOFA. It just wants you to talk broadly about how your FA award is going to be used. And I think of this as kind of a theory of change. We know what FA objectives we're going to be choosing, so work backwards and talk about what needs to happen for those FA objectives to be accomplished. And I think the FA eligible uses fit perfectly into that idea. So the remaining 4 parts of question 6, because it is a 5-part question, are only to be completed if you're doing those FA objectives. And so 6A is only for people who will be expanding operations into a new geographic area. 6B is for applicants that are expecting to serve new targeted population, and so on. And so something to note here is that the first objective is different from last year's application. In last year's app, it was asking about if you plan to serve a new investment area or areas. And this year, they're asking if you plan to serve new geographic areas, which you delineate by state or county. So that's something to note. For the first 2 types of FA objectives, the ones that are relating to serving new populations or new areas, just make sure to talk about them in a way that the fund has asked you to talk about them, which is to talk about them in relation to the number of potential clients, growth prospects, areas covered, and the types of financial products and services that you're going to offer to those new populations or areas. And so one thing to mention here is that new in this year's application is the idea that you can serve an eligible market, which is to say that you can expand into an area that isn't in your current target market. The fund is clear that you might have to amend your CDFI fund defined target market in your certification application later on if your expansion merits that amendment, but you'll have to revisit that if expanding into a new area is a priority for you. And so one last administrative thing to consider about these FA objectives is that they are new concepts, so questions about them are to be expected. And Heather was talking about the service requests in AMIS earlier. I'd use those if you have any questions about this part. They're not super new. We had FA objectives last year, but there's been some changes to them this year. And even just being the second year, I think there's still going to be questions. So there's another second year idea to consider in this year's FA application, and that's performance goals and measures. And these show up all throughout the FA guide. And I think this is a tool that makes sure that unrealistic goals are not showing up on your application. So basically what you have to do for each part of question 6 is to write down goals that correspond to each FA objective that you choose. So say you've chosen the last FA objective, which is to increase the volume of current products and services. Well, you'll need to give quantified totals for the lending you expect to accomplish with your award and quantified totals for the increase of service provision that you expect to accomplish. And the FA guide this year especially is clear that you'll be held to those goals, so make sure to be realistic. And in last year's application, I was mentioning this earlier, the performance goals and measures would be reduced to correspond to how big your award is in relation to your requested amount. So say you asked for $500,000 and you got $250,000. Well, your performance goals and measures would be cut down, and this year that's not the case. So you're going to be held to those performance goals and measures even if your award is cut down. So just be very realistic with your performance goals and measures so that you don't put something down that you can't reach. And I think this is going to be hardest on the younger groups whose ability to meet their goals is really a function of whether they receive the whole award or not, because they don't have a ton of other resources to draw on. And so to those groups, I'd say just be really thorough in how you develop your performance goals and measures, and have a plan if your award gets cut a little bit. I do think that the fund is going to do a little less cutting of awards because of this. That's definitely speculation, though. We're not positive how that's going to turn out. Number 7 is really a classic NACA question. It asks about your strategic goals for the application. And as Heather was saying earlier, those don't have to mirror your strategic goals if you have strategic goals for your organization. They're just strictly for the NACA application. And I advise 3 or 4. You can have up to 5, but with limited character counts, that can be, you just get the feeling like you can't say everything that you want to. Question 8 is asking about your award history. And so the prompt for this question is, if you've received a previous award, provide an explanation for how a new award differs from awards from past requests. So this one's pretty self-explanatory. Even if the award is going to accomplish a similar things for you that previous awards have, talk about how your organization's at a different stage, and it's larger, or its client base is a little different now, or maybe your award will do something fundamentally different this year. So number 9 is another classic NACA question, and it's asking about risks that could undercut your strategic goals. And I think it's really important to answer this thoughtfully. It's a demonstration that your native CDFI has given a lot of thought to what might cause you to not reach your goals. And so it really suits you to lay out a few risks and systematically discuss how you're planning for each one. And so, risks that are really common for native CDFIs are their rural status, relatively small client base, and just a lack of partners in Indian country, to give you a few ideas. So jumping to question 10, what is your CDFI's communication or community coordination strategy, how are you participating in local, state, regional, and federal economic development plans that impact the communities that you serve? So for native CDFIs, I think there's a big opportunity to talk about how you work with the tribe that you serve, if you do. Basically, the fund wants to know if you're operating on your own or with other entities. And that's the guidance that they've given to the reviewers, is evaluate whether the applicant is working with on their own or with other entities. And so I think this could be tough for native CDFIs, just because sometimes there's a lack of partnerships available, and especially for the younger groups. But try to be creative here. Talk about funding partnerships, or do you report to credit agencies? Are you part of any coalitions? Those types of things. Question 10B is, what partnerships are you using or planning to use? And so I don't see any problem with any overlap here from 10A. Just try and come at it from a different perspective. 10A is sort of how are you a part of their plans, and 10B is more how are your partnerships assisting you, and how are they enabling your clients and your target market. And so we're going to jump to the next slide here. It's almost 1, so we're almost an hour. We're almost an hour in. I do want to be able to go through all the changes in the FA application. I think I've got about 15 more minutes to talk here. So if you all can hang in, we'd appreciate that. But this is also going to be recorded, so we'll distribute that to you afterwards, and so you can hear this part if you have to leave, if you have a meeting or something like that. So I'm going to jump in to this third section of the business plan narrative here.
This section of the NACA is only one question, and so it asks you to outline how your native CDFI creates short-term and long-term outcomes in the communities that you serve. And so there's language in the FA guide here about using evidence-based and factual data to support your answer. So I would advise definitely using quantified data here. So do you have an annual report where a lot of your impact is already outlined? Or do you have a market study? Do you have, did your tribe distribute any surveys that has data in it that you can use? That type of thing. I would say, though, that this is a really good opportunity to complement that quantitative data with some success stories. So, maybe outline quantitatively the impacts that your short-term and long-term that your CDFI has, and then have a success story that's representative of those two, or maybe two success stories, one that's representative of short-term outcomes and another that's representative of long-term outcomes. I just think there's a really good opportunity. I know all you native CDFIs are really good at this. I think there's a good opportunity to knock this one really out of the park. And I'd also like to note to make sure that you discuss outcomes rather than outputs. And so the difference being that an output would be like, our native CDFI served 37 clients with credit counseling. An outcome being our native CDFI increased our clients' credit scores by an average of X points through our credit counseling. And so a really important thing to know about this year's app is how the scoring changes affect each question. And I want to bring that up here because with the new scoring system, this is a 12-point question. And this is part of the section where most NACA FA applicants will be cut 30%. And so, like if I were you, I would write this question first and then just revisit it over the next month and strengthen it and make it as strong as possible because there's so much weight to it. Next slide, please. Yeah, perfect. And so for the market and competitive analysis section, that's seven points, and it's just question 12. You're asked to identify trends and primary competitors in your target market. And the context provided in the FA guide says that this question exists because the fund wants to understand your awareness of your target market and your place within your target market. And so I would use really certain language here. Say things like, we know that, rather than we think that, just to create that level of certainty in your narrative. Since the FA is focused mostly on lending and growth, make sure and note those trends and the competitors in those markets that relate to those ideas before you list anything else. If there's room for discussion of other types of competitors or trends, go ahead and talk about those. But this question is locked down to 2,000 characters, which is code for you're going to want to write more than you actually can. So I don't think that will be a concern. One final reminder for this question is that you have to know where you're getting your data from. I know I've harped on this a couple times, but you'll get docked if you don't say where you're getting your data from. So just make sure and cite. Next slide, please. So the management and track record is 12 points. So another heavy section here. And the title to this question is policies and procedures, and I don't want the title of that question to throw you off. It's not just asking about policies and procedures. It wants to know, and you wouldn't know this if you didn't look at the FA guide, it wants to know that you have a track record and strong management in place to reach your goals. So talk about the experience and the accountability to your target market that your board of directors has. Talk about how your long time and experienced staff have different areas of expertise that mold you into a successful CDFI. And I think this is another question that shows how committed you are to expanding in the way that you lay out in this application, as well as how strategic and thoughtful you've been in deciding how you want to expand. And what I mean by that is, how can you reach your goals if you don't have the tools in place to do so? And this question is really how you demonstrate that you've got the tools in place to do so and you've thought about how you're going to do that. If you have things that you need to change, lay out a concrete timeline that has actual dates in it to show that you've thought about some of the administrative parts of this expansion. And I think to the readers, it's just going to make that expansion look more realistic. And so as I was saying, the language in the FA guide is that the fund is using this question to understand your CDFI's management and staffing to determine the relative likelihood and viability of executing your FA objectives and strategic goals. And so I pulled that straight from the FA guide so that you can use that to mold what you write. So just make sure and respond to it in that way. Next slide, please. So for the financial position section of the narrative, the number of points aren't given, and that's because it's not used in the business plan review part of the scoring system. It's not in step 3. And so questions 14 through 17 aren't in step 3. The FA guide does say that these are kind of loosely used in step 2 and step 3 and potentially even step 4. But there's not as good a direction as to how they're using these questions to score your application. That being said, I wouldn't take it lightly. And so for question 14, you're asked to discuss how you view your current financial position. If you've trended positively with respect to your finances, discuss how you've accomplished those positive trends and how you expect to capitalize and continue with those trends. And my personal advice here is not to avoid any negative aspects of your financial position. The readers, whether it be the staff or external reviewers, are intelligent people. They're experts in community development finance, and so you should address any weaknesses in the financial portion of your application and discuss how you worked on those or how you plan to work on those. So for example, if you stagnated on self-sufficiency over the last few years, how do you plan on fixing that? Lay out a plan to fix that. And so as you can see, question 14 is really the meat part of this application, of this part of the application. It's the most open-ended, and 15, 16, and 17 are more yes or no, and then expand if you've answered yes to those. So I focus more on 14 than the others in this section. Perfect. And so section 7 of the business plan review part of the scoring is growth and financial projections. It's 7 points, questions 18 through 20. This section should complement your financial projections really well, which from the CD5 Fund's perspective are the entries into AMIS. And so this idea actually applies to all of the questions in the section. NACA readers should be able to move back and forth from your projections and the narrative and not get confused or lost. And so make sure your operations grow in a way that makes sense with all of the lending growth. So if you project a lot of lending growth over the next 3 years, your expenses are likely going to need to grow as well, and especially if you plan to bring on new staff. Question 18 wants to know how the FA award will build, increase, or augment your ability to reach your strategic goals and FA objectives. And so you're seeing the focus on growth here again with the FA award. So make sure and talk about new things. I've got new here in all caps that your organization will be able to do with the FA award. Question 19 is asking about your plans to increase production goals for current staff or to bring on new staff. And you're going to want the overall story of your application to match this question. So if you're saying in other parts of the narrative, for example, that you're stretched really thin right now, you won't want to talk about how you're going to increase lending and development service provision without bringing on new staff or without bringing on new partnerships or using more consultants. So just make sure the overall story makes sense. And question 20 is asking about the rationale behind each of your projected figures that correspond to your financial statements. So explain asset growth, liability growth, net asset growth, income and expense growth. And again, not to say the same thing here, but you want to show that you've been realistic with your financial goals. If you can't say exactly how you arrived at those figures in your financial projections, then that's going to be viewed negatively. This question is really a chance to show that you were very thoughtful when making your financial projections. And what I do for this section is I start with talking about justifying the growth in my loan portfolio, because as CDFIs, that's really where everything starts. It affects income and expense and drives what we need for capitalization purposes. It's hard to build out projections for any other section without talking about your loan portfolio first. And so I want to leave you there with tips and strategies for the FA app and encourage anyone to reach out to us if they have questions. And I'm going to turn it back over to Heather here, who's going to go over some final tips.
Perfect. Thanks, Caleb. That was a lot of information. That was really good. So thank you. So yeah, like Caleb said, we're just going to close with some final tips. I know we went over on our time a little bit, so we apologize for that. And like we said, we'll send this recording to everybody. But yeah, there's just a lot to cover. So in closing, this is kind of a reiteration of what we've been kind of hitting home throughout the whole webinar is, make sure you address any obvious weaknesses and really have a strategy around that narratively. Make sure that you cite all sources. Caleb said that. I said that. You just want to make sure that you're backing that up. Make sure you answer all the questions asked and exactly what is asked. And so I know that sounds really simple, but it's something that doesn't happen a lot of times with applications, and you don't want to be kind of dinged or lose any points because you didn't do exactly what they asked you to do. So especially with all the guidance they provide. So just make sure that you do that. And don't do it alone. If you can pull in other partners, other staff members, board members, and really try to use them as resources as you put together either a TA or an FA application, definitely do that because, the TA is a lot to put together, but the FA is, an even bigger mountain to kind of climb. And so really try to think about your resources that you have on hand. And then, like I said earlier, too, be clear and concise. Think meat on the bones, but no fat. Like, really be thoughtful about the answers that you have because you're really trying to make your case, tell your story, and answer their questions and work in the character count. And so you really want to be very clear and direct with your writing. Finally, triple check your math, and triple and double check any of the numbers you enter. There's so many that you have to work with in these applications, specifically the FA application, that this is just going to be really important and just always a good way to just kind of make sure that, you're all good. And then finally, submit early. Again, that SF424 is due on Friday. I knew I'd say it one more time. And the application itself is due April 4th. But again, to save yourself stress and any sort of tech headaches that can come up, if at all possible, submit early. Even if it's a day early, at least it's off your plate and you're good to go. So that being said, I'll close with our final tips, and we'll go to our last slide, which is just our slide that says, does anybody have any questions that we can answer? And we'll, give folks a second to kind of send those our way and see what we can answer. Cool.
So people want to know when this will be available for them to listen to again and how they get it.
Perfect. So Flo is also joining us for this webinar, and she said people want to know when we'd be sending this out. We should be able to send it out either today or tomorrow. The recording doesn't take too long to do, so we'll make sure we get that out to you shortly.
Another question is, I'm in AMIS and training materials are dated. Where do I locate the pre-app guide that you referred to in pages 5 through 7?
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Oh, sorry. If you go to the CDFI Fund's website and then hover over their Programs tab and then go down to Native Initiatives and click on that, you're going to see links for NACA TA and NACA FA. And once you click on those, all the TA stuff is under the TA link and the FA stuff under the FA link. But just go to the CDFI Fund, just Google CDFI Fund and you'll find your way there.
Yeah, they'll list all the application materials, and they have been updated. We've seen the updated materials for 2018. So, yeah, like Caleb said, go to the website. They'll list all the documents, and you'll be able to find that pre-application guide.
And we'll just include links for both of those in our post email, too.
Yeah, absolutely. And then do we have any other questions? No? Perfect. Okay, cool. So if you
I guess they're just saying thank you.
Oh, thank you. Well, if you end up
That's
having,
not a question.
if you have any other questions, feel free to shoot our team an email or give us a call. We're happy to kind of be here throughout the process. So, yeah, feel free to reach out to us that way too. And you'll see the email from us with those links and with the recording and everything. But thank you all so much for your time and good luck during this NACA season.